Boa tarde a todos. Então, queria dar início a mais uma sessão. Eu vou falar um pouco em português e uma parte em inglês, embora o professor Dom Peterson já fale um pouco de português. Eu fiquei completamente assustado um mês atrás quando ele fez uma pergunta em português aqui no seminário. E ele está aqui só há 5 meses. Okay, it's my pleasure to receive my colleague, Professor Dom Peterson, that was here in IEA for the next at least 2 years. Yes, 7 months is more. And Professor Peterson is a philosopher by formation at the University College of London, but he has a very diverse trajectory. He is also a master degree in basic fundamentals of technology of information. He has also a master degree in philosophy and psychology by the University of Edinburgh. He was a full professor at the Science of Computation of the University of Shantou in China, and also a associate professor in the same area at the University of Ningbo. My Chinese pronunciation is very bad, but also has many collaborations in other universities like University of London, and it's our pleasure to have Don here. And the idea of this seminar is a little bit to discuss this new, not completely new, but an area of the AI, artificial intelligence, and how it could be linked or connected to the idea of risk, and make some kind of challenges for the educational perspective and citizenship nowadays. Okay? Eu gostaria só de lembrar novamente que está sendo gravado e transmitido, se as pessoas terem certeza que os celulares estão desligados, e no momento das perguntas, cada um se manifesta só mencionando o nome. Thank you very much, Don. It's your time.
Boa tarde. É muito prazer de estar aqui com vocês hoje, de discutir as perguntas de riscos e oportunidades em uma era cognitiva. O mundo mudou. As máquinas mudarão. A vida mudou. Então, qual é o destino dessa nova ponte? Essa é ponte. Quais são seus riscos e oportunidades? Que são seus desafios para a educação? Agora em inglês. Contents for you. So first, I introduced the concept of ditropism. And I hope my English is okay for you, not too fast. I believe that all technologies are ditropic. Now, by this I mean that they produce good effects and bad effects, or both, according to use, context, and purpose. Now, by the way, you can have these slides, and you can also see the video of this event. So the slides you can print on paper and write on. You don't have to work very hard now. The technologies are ditropic in that their effects happen according to how they're used, in what situations they're used, and what goals we have. Now, these are all negotiable factors. Therefore, risk and benefit are non-essential. They are issues of utilization in context. Now, we can make lots and lots of simple examples. You buy a hammer. Is it good? Is it bad? Of course it is not one or the other. It depends what you do with it. Yeah? And it's that simple. The difference for the sophisticated technologies of artificial intelligence, etc., is it all gets more complicated and less obvious. Now, is the English okay? It's okay, right. So, ditropism has a logical form. Now, maybe some of you know predicate calculus? Yeah? But you can read this quite easily. It says for all technologies, there exists two contexts at least, such that utilizing the technology in context 1 is a good thing, and utilizing it in context 2 is a bad thing. And it's very easy to give examples of this. I mean, who says surveillance is a good thing? Who says it's a bad thing? It depends who's doing it and why. If you have a baby upstairs in a little bed, maybe you want surveillance, even audio surveillance. If you walk in the street, maybe you do not want police surveillance. It depends on context, etc. Therefore, our ethical task is steerage so as to produce a good effect. Yeah? Some people would even say an atomic bomb is a good thing sometimes. Yeah? Not very often, I don't think. But our futurist task is predictive steerage, right? And this is a very common task. We simply need to prepare ahead of time for conditions which we predict. Yeah, so they don't just catch us out. Now it gets interesting. Ditropism also has a dialectical form. And a very good indication of this is the Chinese Taijitu, which is up there. The point being that opportunity and risk form a dialectical dynamic. It's not just that they are opposites, they actually interact. And that is part of the meaning of the Taijitu symbol here, that there is a dynamic to the dialectical relationship. Now, where we can say, where there is opportunity, there is also risk. Where there is risk, there's also opportunity. And this is not just playing with words. If we have the opportunity to build an even faster racing car, we may be very happy if we are the engineers, but the risk of killing people may increase. If there is a risk of a flood in the river, this is maybe a bad thing, but it's also an opportunity to develop our defenses better so that we're more sure of being protected. And that opportunity is itself a risk because we may hire the wrong contractors who waste our money and do a lot of harm. And that can be also an opportunity because having been silly in choosing the wrong contractor, we maybe hire a lawyer to help our company to avoid that happening in the future, etc., etc. So, as I've found very often in Chinese thought, the underlying idea here is actually quite common sense. It can be made to look metaphysical, and if you read the classics, it often does look metaphysical. But in fact, this sort of thing is basic to everyday thinking in China, and That's why I express it like this. But if you want the classics, Lao Tzu and his Dao De Jing, chapter 2, he says high and low rest on each other. Heraclitus in fragment 60 says the way up and the way down are one and the same. So it can sound like some very mysterious statement. I think the more meaningful thing is to apprehend the basic message of the Taijitu symbol, which is that opposites flow into each other dynamically and indicate each other. So here we're interested in opportunity and risk. So I will now define cyberology as the study of the benefits and risks of new technologies relevant to life in cyberspace. Right? So it's a social conception of it, and I've tried just to put this on one slide. So I'll give you the categories I propose, the matrix I propose, and the methodology I propose. And later in this talk, I'll say that this sort of thing should be taught in school. I do not think it has been very systematically developed yet. People say a lot about how wicked surveillance is and so on, but I'm trying to give a framework here within which we can talk. Now, all frameworks are good and bad. All frameworks box us in ways we don't like, but like many things, we can't live with it and we can't live without it. So as we say in English, we take this with a pinch of salt, but I think it's better to have a framework which you can find exceptions to than to have no framework. So I make 3 basic categories. The first is the conditions under which we now live. Now, in computer science terms, I call this MBIF, meaning massive, volatile, immediate, and fragmented. Now, this is just engineering fact. It's not supposed to be anything obscure. They're massive because data is massive, and with the expansion of the Internet of Things, it will become more so. It's volatile because change in the world is transmitted to us immediately, or almost immediately. And so it's particularly in the business world that they talk about this, because they recognize that their circumstances have changed in a way that demands agility, and without agility, their businesses may go bankrupt. So this is real world stuff. Immediate is obvious. We did have telephone calls across the world many years ago, so it's not completely new. But the bombardment of immediate data from everywhere, except maybe not the moon, is a greater phenomenon than it was. Now, fragmented has at least 2 levels. At an engineering level, our data is fragmented because it may be heterogeneous, right? Audio, paper, digital, etc., etc. It does not come to us conveniently packaged in a coherent story, which would be very nice, but it hasn't happened yet. At a higher level, it's fragmented because it's decontextualized. If you live in a village, most data that comes to you will be heavily contextualized, say in the Middle Ages or something. And you know pretty much who would have said this and who would have planted that carrot and so on. But the data that's coming in to us mostly does not have this conveniently contextualized character. So it may be massive, and we may be able to do useful things with it, but it is fragmented in more than one sense. So I call that MBIF. It's not because I like making up words, but there does not exist a word for it, as far as I know. Now, the technologies we're concerned with I call ARUC, meaning AI, robotics, ubiquitous computing, and connectivity. Now, the least well-known of these is ubiquitous computing. It was defined in 1991 by Mark Weiser, and it's still on the way in, if you like. A well-known example, though, is that you have a sort of button on your jacket, and the environment knows exactly where you are. Yeah. I think this was first introduced to public view in the film called The Minority Report. Anyway, I find that not a bad umbrella for the technologies we're concerned with. Now, regarding their effects on life, I call this EWIW, so that's education, work, industry, and well-being. But you pick your own categories if you like. The idea is to form a matrix where the four multiply together, giving us a lot of little convenient boxes to put things in. Now, the methodology I favor is multidisciplinary, and I won't take time with that right now, but I think there's a lot to say on that issue. It is not a guarantee of success. It can be a real waste of time, but it can be really useful as well. I think we need to be both theoretical and practical. This topic of cyberology is not exclusively one or the other. And we need to be both critical and technical. For example, I think the absence of computer science knowledge is quite a negative, and particularly, well, among philosophers sometimes. They often do need to go and do a little bit of homework, if you ask me. So anyway, what I'll do now is to go through 4 cases. And I will argue in each case that we need to catch up with reality. Now, I don't mean the people in this room necessarily, but I think as a society, a world society, we've allowed both education and the dictionary to lag about 15 years behind reality, and I think it disempowers us, and I think it makes us inarticulate. But when I've done that, I'll turn to the subject of education. And as I go, I'll introduce terms like cyber sense, and then I'll show a summary of these in a lexicon. But within the space of an hour, what I can do is to mention these things, and in the discussion time, we can go into depth on any of them you wish, but fully to present these topics would take more time than we have. On the other hand, I think you'll see what I mean quite easily. So in my view, we increasingly need what I call cyber sense. And this is practical understanding of how to live in a world of information overload, fragmented delivery, compromised privacy, multiple and changing interfaces, software upgrades, multiple passwords, etc. It's a real pain in the neck, isn't it? It's a real bore, unless you like being distracted. If you can't face the blank canvas, as the artists say, then it's great to be distracted. You're hoping for one more text message from your phone company, and so on. Anyway, this is not what Epictetus thought. And he's there on the left. He was an ancient Greek Stoic. Now, Stoicism is part of the Hellenistic period that comes after Aristotle. And the reason for the sweets beside him is that that's the sort of example he gave. And other Stoics like Zeno also gave these examples. They said, well, if you go to a party and the nicest sweets in the world come past, you should be able to refuse them. Yeah. He didn't say you should always refuse them, actually. He just said you should be able to, you know. And my case here will be that there's wisdom there from the ancient Greeks, which is applicable today. It's not that they were acquainted with cyberspace, but I will suggest that the connection is real. So, how do we navigate this maelstrom of data and distraction? When do we attend to something and when not? Do we use our cell phone at the meal table? So we face a dilemma of attention. If we attend to everything, we will just die and become useless. If we ignore anything, we may lose out. So it's a dilemma, which my nephews and nieces are aware of in Scotland. Yeah. So anyway, Aristotle advocated practical wisdom, or what he called phronesis. It's, for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6. And this is practical judgment in real life. Now, he interestingly thought that this is acquired with experience. So, first year of school kid going to school, but then with experience in life or your profession or whatever, you acquire phronesis. There's a maturity aspect to it. Now, the Stoics advocated a type of rational detachment, and in any case, we need to be methodical in navigating cyberspace. And I think as the human species has mostly just not woken up to this. They haven't even identified it as an issue. So I think we need cyber phronesis, cyber stoicism, and we need education which teaches habits and methods advocated by the ancients, applied now as cyber sense. Now, when I say teach, I don't really mean to be bossy. I mean that the educational system should at least make kids aware that these things are issues, and they're making a personal decision if they allow themselves to be bullied by cyberspace, and in fact, they're being a bit weak. It's not something to be proud of. So here are just a few points. These charts are not encyclopedias, but remember EWIW in my framework. In education, we need to look at the school curriculum, which is not to say it's all rubbish. It's just to say it may need something extra. We can look at the Stoics, Aristotle, and the whole issue of being methodical and deliberate in how we use all these lovely mobile phones, etc., etc. And how do we use the 1,000 television channels, which quite soon we will have. It really won't be long before you from your home can go all over the world and watch their television. Now, in work, there's the issue of greater effectiveness. There's the issue of reskilling to deal with modern data conditions. Some years ago in London, when I was doing the studies that Mauricio described, I would get maybe one letter a week, maybe one phone call, and I was happy. Now it's just a mass of them, email, text messages. But I remember when email got going in my first job, I came here to Brazil, and this was 20 years ago. When I came back, I had 800 emails waiting. And the number which were relevant was, 5 or something. So I was very struck by this, how they had apparent importance when they came in, but because I wasn't there, I didn't see them. But for this sort of thing, I think short courses are becoming prioritized. They used to be a rather secondary activity for a university, but with the fast change that characterizes modern life, reskilling on something they could not teach you when you were a student because they didn't know it, has become more relevant. And so in the category of wellness, just to state the obvious, These things affect human relations, they affect family life, they affect stress, and we do perhaps need laws and regulations. And admirable there are the French. They've had the nerve, sorry for my throat, they've had the nerve to pass laws that say you can't do this and you cannot do that. And, you know, they've had the courage to say that school kids can't use their mobile phones all the time. And I think there's more. They've also had the courage to oppose, what is it called, cyber justice or something. It's the use of AI in judicial legal work. And I don't know the details, but they've actually forbidden or half forbidden something that the rest of us are just complaining about. So that's halfway through the talk now. Any questions now? No? Yeah, sure. So I'll now talk about meta-robotics. To state the very obvious, the robots are coming and the robots are dangerous because they will take our jobs. And it's even worse than that. They will take our jobs in a biased way. Yeah? Not because they're evil, just because this is how it is. So if there's a robot that can pick potatoes out of the ground, then the agricultural worker who picks potatoes out of the ground could lose their job. If there's a more sophisticated job that the robots cannot do, then those employees are less likely to lose their jobs. It's obvious, really. If the robots could do 20% of human work in an even way across the board, then, of course, we could reduce the 5-day week to 4, we could have a 3-day weekend, everybody get paid the same, everybody's happy. But that utopian outcome seems highly unlikely, and what we're likely to see is an unfair effect and an effect of a second digital divide. Anyway, what I propose is, to me, in fact, is common sense. I don't think I'm saying anything very obscure, but we need to anticipate this situation, and through what I called predictive steerage, we need to do something about it. And again, education is the obvious port of call there. We need education, what I call meta-robotics, which simply means the human jobs which we do on top of the robots. Yeah. We need people to teach short courses so that the public understand robots and don't just obediently accept what they're told to accept. We need consultancy, training, teaching, etc. We need people who understand intelligent agents, which have not quite hit the market yet. People who understand medical robotics, geriatric carer robots, agricultural robots, personal robots that look after you, tailoring of robots to suit their new owners. Then there's the humanoid robotics we hear about from Japan. Robots in every industry. It requires expertise in HRI, which is human-robot interaction, and also RRI, which is robot-robot interaction. This is all stuff the world is going to need, and I think better we prepare by making this part of educational curriculum before it completely happens. I mean, what would prevent us from doing that? So the Luddites, you see in my picture there, became famous because they worked in woolen mills and they thought the new machinery would take their jobs, so they started destroying the machinery. But of course, they did not win their battle. The machinery survived, and they had not been reskilled in how to maintain it, how to build it, how to look after it, how to use it, etc. So we've already seen this situation, a quite legitimate expectation of loss of employment, together with an unfortunate failure of society to give them something else to do. Right? The same will happen in China, which of course is a huge country, where quite a lot of jobs are done in factories which could be mechanized. And they haven't been yet. But this is a country without a welfare system. If there's a lot of mechanization, which seems likely, then a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and that's a lot of people who could have been reskilled. But you will have your own views on what the profile is of this reskilling. I mean, for example, the job of secretary might seem to be a job that a robot would not do. That's a software robot or hardware robot. But there is expectation, actually, that it is a job which to some extent can be replaced. So it's not just factory workers with dirty hands. You know, it's not just those people. But the danger, as I've said before, is an increase in inequality. That people who are currently on a low wage end up with no job at all. And that's a sort of digital divide, and it is socially dangerous. So again, just a few little remarks. I hope you will look at the slides afterwards, and you can check up on any of these things you like. Now, just regarding regulations, laws, and standards, I think there very roughly are two approaches we can take to dangerous technology. One is to say, oh, we must regulate against it and make ethical decisions and decide if a machine can even be built, whether that's permitted, etc., etc. And sure, we can do these things. But I promote a more positive, less defensive attitude in which we basically prepare for the future. And I'm not convinced it's very difficult to do that. We can see roughly where things are going. It's not really a secret, except in military technology, of course, it is secret. But some of the time, at least, we can predict the way things are going and predict what sort of education we need to prepare for it. Now, I'll be quick with this one. As you see, I put DW, red IW, so this is the third in the series. I'll be quick just because this is a topic for a whole day. But it's a very interesting topic because the ancient Greeks, Heraclitus on the left we have there, were great believers in change and volatility. And what's happened in the business world is that volatility has been recognized as a fact of life, meaning that to survive, a business needs to be agile. Right? And the word agile is their word for it. How great the analysis of this is in some of the books we see, I'm not very sure, but they're certainly right in what they say. Volatility has happened and agility is necessary. And an example they like to give is Nokia. Because Nokia did something quite surprising, and then they did something quite disappointing. So the first thing that happened was they were a photocopier company, and they somehow saw the heat coming around the corner, as it says in the film Heat. And they changed from photocopiers to cell phones. And not only that, they had or engaged some good designers who provided really quite a good interface. And it was consistent between their phones. People found it easy to use. It wasn't baffling. And so half of what people want from a phone existed in something that's actually quite cheap to create. So Nokia survived where, according to them, their photocopier business was going to go downhill. So big tick for them, they were agile. Now, the strange thing is, for whatever reason, later the smartphone came in, and with the smartphone came serious competition from other companies, and Nokia didn't catch on to it very well. So they got bypassed. And the same happened with Google and its success. I mean, there are examples of this where sometimes you get accurate agility and sometimes you don't. And they do say that, for example, having a lot of clever MBA graduates is not a guarantee that you're going to get it right. So it's a slightly mysterious area. But anyway, I'll move on from this, but it's an area where they say in business that cognitive psychology is relevant because they now need to do something called set shifting in executive function of the prefrontal cortex of the brain. At least that's what people think. And they would like to have tests so they could evaluate job applicants and so on for this. But it associates with my MVIF category. This is massive volatile input. And if you can catch on to it, it's an opportunity. If you don't catch on to it, it's a risk. And there's some stuff on them. Right. Now, I'll just speak lastly, my fourth case, on health and cyber stress. There is a growing concern that all this volatility and bombardment is a challenge to our mental health, including the mental health of children. And in the UK, certainly, there are institutions which are looking at this. It's a bit of a difficult one because it's not black and white. It can be that young people are pressurized to be agile, so they become agile. So maybe they're more agile than people from the previous generation. And that includes multitasking, handling bombardment of information, and so on. So I would not suggest that this is black and white, but what we do find missing is a systematic way of responding to it, to the conditions. That's why I have to give it a new name, cyber sense in response to cyber stress. And I think actually that the social sciences, psychology, philosophy, sociology, need to wake up to this in a practical way. Of course, they make judgments and say this and that is a good thing, but we need practical measures which primary school teachers can teach to school kids so they come out of school equipped for the modern world. Huh? So the claim is that cognitive technology is a threat to mental health. Now, as you know already in this talk, I don't quite agree with that. It's not an evil thing that is a threat or a risk. It becomes a threat or a risk if we misuse it. And one other thing the French have done is to pass a law to say that an employer cannot require of an employee that they leave their mobile phone switched on when they go home in the evening and at the weekend. Sorry about that. It seems pretty obvious, but it's something which needed to be done. Now, we see cyber recluse syndrome. We hear about digital detox, internet addiction, social media addiction, decontextualized communication where we don't really know much about the person on the other end of the wire. And as I just said, France has recently made legislation in this area. And I think it not only repositions the social sciences, but it also repositions the arts. because in ways that are perhaps a bit mysterious, the arts are a source of fortitude. Art, sport, and so on are a source of nervous strength and the ability to sustain these conditions. The same could be said of meditation, Tai Chi, things like that. But proper medical analysis of why they are fortifying, I have not seen yet. It's just a general common sense observation. But the usual thing we say is, oh, I play football because I want to be fit, that sort of thing. Well and good, it's good to be fit. But I think in this day and age, there is a perspective needed that some of these practices may protect us from cyber stress. So just a few thoughts on this. But again, I include school curriculum on cyber stoicism. So, you know, a simple example of cyber stoicism would be that you have the nerve not to answer your mobile phone. And recently I was talking with a friend in a restaurant, and her mobile phone rang, and she didn't answer it. And I said, "Why, you haven't answered your phone?" And she said, "Well, no, I'm talking to you." And so I said, I admire that, you know. I didn't tell her she was, in fact, a cyber stoic. But anyway, I just finish off these remarks before I turn to education to say that the opportunities of new technology hardly need to be stated. And I'm not very patient with the idea that they're all evil and they're all wicked. I do think this simple idea of diatropism untangles a certain amount of confusion. It depends what we do with them. But for example, in industry, safety can be greatly increased through predictive maintenance in railway tunnels, also under the water in oil drilling and so on, using the Internet of Things. I mean, there really are safety issues here. Maintenance, by the way, is very often largely a waste of time. They just wander around hoping to find something wrong. But if you have a lot of sensors out there, they can say, beep, 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 you got to go here. And so you get much better value. In agriculture, I mean, of course we need good food. If we can use technology to improve our crops, detect when they're getting rotten and so on, then it's going to be a good thing. And we would not have, finally, the entertainment, the communication, the online communities we have, some new drugs, and so on and so forth, if it were not for these technologies. Now, some risks. I think remembering the yin-yang symbol there, the Taiji 2, there are some obvious dangers. One which is very hard to avoid is that technogenic reality is ahead of education and the dictionary. I mean, of course, we should not be too moralistic about this. School teachers cannot just suddenly become experts in something new unless we give them a year off, you know. And as for the dictionary, it's the dictionary's job to keep things stable and to represent vocabulary which has become established. I mean, these are not just silly people who don't want to listen to me. In fact, editors of dictionaries are not supposed to put in words until they have been in current usage for many years. So we've got a problem. Another is the increased digital divide. Half of Brazil is not internet connected. That's the first digital divide. But now, as Arak gets more sophisticated, if school kids are not even educated in Arak at a rudimentary level, we're going to get a second digital divide. They're going to come out of school incompetent to deal with the technology that surrounds them, etc. And I speak with some conviction because in my own country, which is the UK, there has been an astonishingly rubbish school education system in digital technology. Two associates of mine are involved in trying to put this right, but for some years they have not been taught elementary computer science. They've been taught something called ICT, and that means information and communication technologies, and it has been a very unfortunate development because it means that they come out of school unprepared and unqualified to go and work for a company. I mean, nobody wants to hire them. Yeah? But you can teach elementary computer science. It's not very difficult. Anyway, in work, a risk is that employment is lost through software and hardware robots, and that this effect is selective. In industry, we've all seen the buzzwords: security, privacy, data harvesting, as has certainly been done by Facebook. In fact, it was part of their business model. Data bias. Once you deal with mass data, then if prejudice is built into it for whatever reason, it's hard to detect it. You can't just pluck out a sentence that says Donald Peterson is an idiot. You know, it's not as easy as that. Malware, of course, through any form of communications, can get into computers and do nasty things. If you pull all the plugs out, it can't actually, but if you put the plugs in, there they are. And then we have hacking, of course. Now, a big topic under well-being is Entzauberung, as Max Weber called it, which in English is disenchantment. Now, he felt this was an effect of technological society, but he did not mean the second digital revolution, but maybe he was just plain right. And he raised the question of Wiedertäuberung, which is return of enchantment, and the hope that this could happen. So I take that quite seriously. Karl Marx spoke about ennui, which was another form of alienation. I think this is quite a subtle and deep topic, quite hard to pin down exactly what the problem is, but with all the happiness that comes in watching your television programs and so on for the last few decades, there is this issue that modern technological society is becoming disenchanted, which is a form of mental fatigue or whatever it is. Anyway, other buzzwords are superficiality, logocentricity, meaning centering on words and also centering on images, but not the other communication modalities that exist between real people in real rooms as we are now, and so on and so on. Information overload, etc. These are just some buzzwords, and I think they make it hard to ignore the negative side of the developments we've seen. We've looked at 4 cases now, which I've addressed through the format I proposed for cyberology. I will now suggest that cyberology should be a subject in its own right, and it should be taught in schools at least, and it could be taught in all contexts. The first point is that education is crucial to the equilibration of the forces of technological progress and quality of life, thus elevating opportunities over risks. And we could say that it's perhaps the number one force in this equilibration. I mean, our general problem is that technological process can reduce quality of life, as well as increase quality of life. But to this purpose, education needs to avoid getting out of date and semi-relevant. And I perceive that among young people today, thinking of my own nephew and niece, my sister's children, they have a sense that what they're being given at school and even university is not quite relevant. It's not really taking them to the top of a mountain. It's actually, to some extent, distracting them in relation to their future lives. At least that is perceived. But this is what has happened. And technogenic reality is now several years ahead of our dictionaries and our schools. Yeah? And you can hardly blame them. I mean, if a school teacher is 50 years old, they've got every right to be a school teacher. They can't suddenly know cognitive computing. Unless they come here, of course. But this, I believe, leaves us seriously inarticulate and disempowered. It leaves us inclined to think we have to leave it to the experts to talk about these complicated things. And it also may encourage a second digital divide, where perhaps in time everybody's computer is plugged into the internet, but half of us don't know what's going on. So I propose that cyberology should be taught. It could be school, university, distance education, short courses, etc. But I think it's high time we gave it a name. Now, I've called it Life in the Cognitive Era, and because we hear this prefix cyber all the time, I was disinclined to call it cyberology, but I now think of the two as pretty much the same thing. So how about desiderata, which, as you know, means desirable things for this enterprise? Well, I think we need new, or let's say additional vocabulary, curriculum, formats, and objectives. And I don't mean by any of this that all existing communication is rubbish. I mean that we need something additional. So for conceptualizations, I think we need cyber speak of the sort I've been introducing, cyber sense, cyber stoic, etc. And here we remember Immanuel Kant, who said that concepts without experience are empty. Experience without concepts is blind. So the problem I'm addressing here is the second one, that as a world society, we're more blind than we realize, and we're more dumb than we realize. Now, for curriculum, I think there's a lot of room for maneuver here. Speaking as a computer scientist, I would mention cognitive computing, artificial intelligence, data science. Speaking more as a psychologist, I would say cyber sense, or you could say philosophy. Meta-robotics is really obvious. It's going to happen all over the world, that we should be reskilling, or you could say pre-skilling people in the human tasks associated with making a success of things with robots. And there no doubt are other cyber XYZ words we could call them. So with very short time left, let me just quickly describe what I mean by format. The Brazilian Freire, Rousseau, Dewey, they all had the idea that learners should be active learners. That we're not just stuffing information into them, but we should be skilling them so that they are empowered. And I say bivalent because perhaps little known fact is that the etymology of the Latin word education is a double etymology. It means pushing things in, and it means pulling things out. E stands for out. Yeah. And both seem to be legitimate. Of course, kids need information, but of course, they are not a bucket, and it should empower them with their actual purposes. Now, I say transversal because in the term of Naumar de Almeida Filho, who is here in the Institute, we need some sort of cross-disciplinarity so that the graduate of a school or the graduate of a university has some sort of facility or experience or whatever it turns out to be with using more than one discipline at the same time, or at least working in a team which has more than one discipline going in it. And these are real skills. I've seen a lot of time wasted in things that are called cross-disciplinary, and they're not effective anyway. And lastly, I mentioned transferable skills and meta skills. With information technology, the pressure to learn and memorize information has gone down because computers can do it for us. But the skill of using Google effectively, for example, has become really quite prioritized. So instead of sitting there in our armchair and saying, oh, I know so much, you can ask me everything, I know everything, it's not really so much like that. It's more, if you need something, I can find it for you quite quickly. It's that sort of thing. And that's not the same as memorized knowledge. And then by meta skill, I mean the ability to evaluate our own skills. Am I really the person for this job? I think I won't find it. Why don't you do it? Because actually, you've got experience with it. Now, these are not exactly the virtues that traditionally are associated with a good school graduate. But it doesn't mean that school teachers would deny them. They just haven't been so much of a focus. So I think the objectives of cyber education should, of course, be quality and equality, but I think they include relevance. Is this stuff actually useful? And that doesn't just mean in a very practical way. It could be useful for my well-being. I mean, studying Tai Chi might be very good for a person's well-being, but it's not going to earn them any money, you know. So there's my provisional cyber lexicon. I'll spare you the experience of having me read them all out. You might like to advise whether these cyber prefixes should have a hyphen. The history of most hyphens is that they start life there, but as we get more used to the word, they disappear. So, for example, suburban was originally a hyphenated word, suburban. Now we would never use it. So I quite deliberately miss it out to show that I think these are legitimate words, not words under test. But there is a friendly challenge here. Can you find anything in the dictionary which expresses exactly what these terms are used here to express? Particularly with ditropic, I think there is no such word. It's not enough to say this is a two-sided coin or it's a sword with two edges or something. I mean, I don't want metaphors here. This is literal language. So now the summary. We've taken a ditropic approach to the opportunities and risks of new technologies with attention to education. That's what we've done in this talk. I've presented the definition of ditropism, a framework for cyberology with applications, and of course there are more examples. Some desiderata for education in cyberology, and a lexicon of terms. So just before we give up, there's a little joke for you. Okay, thank you.
Now it's okay. Okay. Okay, you have now moment for comments, questions. You may ask in Portuguese if you like. I think Dom can a little bit, and I can help with the translation. Pina?
First of all, thank you, Dan, for your talk. It was very nice. I'd like you to comment, please. How do you think we can adapt or apply this knowledge of cyber sense at school, as you proposed, knowing that, well, this concept is quite multidisciplinary, and our curriculum is disciplinary. So how to deal with that?
I think if it's a great question. I mean, I think if it's at primary school level, we maybe don't need to worry too much about disciplines. I mean, they could do role play, like one person be mummy, the other be the 6-year-old kid who's getting a mobile phone call. Maybe they should each note down what they're thinking. The kid is thinking, oh, I've got to answer it. It might be Mary. And the mother's thinking, now look, you've got to become a sensible human being. You know, your food's going to get cold while you're doing it. We can't talk to you. That would be one way, just to bring out in the open the things that different people are thinking. And we could think of various role-play games. And it may be that that's enough, actually. It may be that we don't need to keep drilling students all through secondary school and all through university in these things. It might be an interesting experiment just to introduce some such role play. Yeah? And they could use real mobile phones and question each other. Then you reverse the roles, you see, so they get both points of view and have arguments about it.
Outra questão? On the back. Cláudia, atrás.
No, thank you very much for the talk. Could you go a little bit further on the personal competencies that should be developed to face all these challenges?
Well, from the Stoics, one which they like to call self-control was not an outright rejection of the sweetie they saw in front of them, or in our case, the phone call we're getting. It was not a condemnation of it. It was just that they thought we should have enough self-control to decide whether to do things or not. Because if we're dominated by our mobile phone, it's a bit unfortunate. It's only a phone, after all. So that's one. Taking from Aristotle and phronesis, I would need to think more about exactly what we would do in the school. But phronesis is based on feedback. You act in the world and you see whether you get a good result or not. Now, theoretically, I think cybernetics provides us with an interesting perspective on that. Let me just go down a bit. Oh, yeah. Okay, I mean, this may seem like a surprising answer, but I think a little articulated aspect of our competence in the world is that we are cybernetic organisms in a feedback loop. Now, if I'm right in saying that some uses, even domestic uses, of the new technologies are actually destructive, then teaching which encourages the perception that we're perhaps out of a loop. For example, we're getting out of touch with our kids or our family or our parents or our homework, and we're just becoming distracted, I think can take the cybernetic loop as a model. Actually, there's Norbert Wiener's version of it, and I think it's a topic for another day, but I think it's a key insight to functionality in the world. What did we go more? Yeah, okay. That was for if we got through the first slides too quickly.
Aqui na frente.
Thanks, Professor, for your lecture. I would like you to comment more specifically about the France regulations concerning the usage of technology on school.
I mean, I only know so much, and there may be other people here who know more. All I know is that I was happy to hear that they've started passing laws. So the one about mobile phones says that the kids cannot spend the whole lunch break talking on their phone. And so it's not preventing them from ever talking on the phone, but they want to make lunchtime a holy time. And it is in France. I mean, it's a virtue of the French lifestyle that they treat lunchtime as, it's not only gastronomic, it's a time of rest. And so you could call it an extension of that. What else have I heard about France? Oh yes, in the law case, again, you know as much as I do, but that there is increasing use of artificial intelligence in legal activities and even judicial activities on the side of the authorities to decide that, you know, this person's probably guilty, this person's probably not. And there's a huge danger of data bias there. For example, if you use neural nets to process data coming in from surveillance, as you probably know, a neural net does not declare itself. It is not a set of explicit rules which we can evaluate. It's what we call digital porridge. And so if you use that technology, there is a danger that it may in fact be differentiating according to the person's facial characteristics or skin color or whatever. And this is not my opinion, this is just a fact. And a well-known illustration is that I think in Russia, they wanted to have a neural net with a camera which could direct a tank with no driver. And it would just go around shooting the enemy. Yeah? And so they took photographs where the neural net was going to learn to differentiate between a forest with enemy tanks in it and a forest with no enemy tanks. So in the morning, they took the tanks and put them in the forest and took lots of pictures and then used them to train the neural net. It's called training, as you probably know. Then in the afternoon, they took all the tanks away and took lots more pictures and gave them to the neural net. And of course, they're just digital data streams to the neural net, just pixel screens. And told the neural net, there are no tanks here, so you better learn to know what that looks like. And I think for one or two testing sessions, it seemed that they had trained the neural net. But then it turned out that it was hopeless. And if they put it into a real tank, it would go around shooting all the wrong people. And they found out what was really going on was that in the morning, it was dark because it was raining. And in the afternoon, it was bright and sunny. And what the neural net had really learned to distinguish was dark days and sunny days. Yeah? So it's just an example of how neural nets may be very clever, and sophisticated neural nets may be even more clever, and they can do facial recognition now, as we all know. I mean, they're not rubbish, but they can be misunderstood, and they don't easily indicate to us what they're doing wrong. So it's an example of a danger of relying too much or too uncritically on these technologies, or using them in an unmixed way. You see, they should be mixed up with humans in the task. It should be a collaborative task.
Professor, thank you for the talk. How far do you see the school system that claims to teach technology when they teach actually practical robotics and some concepts on maybe programming, but they're not teaching cyberology because they're not talking about well-being. They're not talking about ethics on robotics. So how far do you see we are right now? I mean, worldwide, maybe some other experience from you on this matter.
Well, okay. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that you're always going to get some great school teachers who do just what we'd like. I mean, everybody knows that. And I think I was fortunate I had some, and they're inspirational. But they're actually going beyond the curriculum. If you're concerned about what's standard and what's in the curriculum, and also what can be done with a very large class size, because that's very restrictive on the teacher, then I think worldwide there's not much going on. But looking in a positive way, IBM are quite keen on this sort of thing. Now, I know some people don't like IBM because they're so big and powerful, but, you know, are they all bad? If you look on YouTube, they have some really quite good short videos about cognitive computing. And I don't see any other entity or company who's doing this. So if we're going to take something a bit difficult and then simplify it for school kids, we need at least to have the first thing in the first place. And the same goes for data science. There's an extraordinary situation in London at the moment where data science is just about the number one employability factor, the top one. So if you want to make money and get a job fast, school yourself in statistics and big data analytics, and you can just sail in. Much bigger salary than most people get. So it's got very high employability, and also I think our country needs it. It's not just a waste of time. We don't teach it much in universities, and I think we don't teach it at all in schools. So I have to give a negative answer there. But things don't have to be the way they are. Mathematics teachers can teach statistics. I mean, they're not without skill in that. And short courses in big data analytics could be another thing. I think incentive is something. It's tricky because if you give one school teacher an extra bonus for doing something, then the others will feel jealous. You know, so it is hard to incentivize extra work. Going on to the school curriculum, I think in my country there is hope for teaching simple computer science, and kids who are inclined that way would enjoy it. They'd enjoy the feeling of connection with their near future lives if it's presented appropriately. But something went wrong. I don't know what it was exactly, but the people I know are Achim Jung and one of his associates who are trying to do something about it in my country. But in general, as you can tell, I think on the positive side there is hope, but on the negative side, it's something to be ashamed of. I mean, it's a system letting the young people down because it's not equipping them with what they'll need when they go forward. And we're only talking about a few % of their time. I mean, they can still study art and history and everything they want. I just think they should get some of this. Because without it, they're going to feel at the age of 25 the way my mother feels at the age of 92. But I don't see good reason for not doing it. Yeah, so we agree. I mean, the computer science is not all that difficult, to be honest. I mean, you need to study it. You need to put in an effort. You need to have a teacher. But it's not like higher mathematics. I mean, that really is difficult. Or Einstein or something like that. But I think there is a bit of a myth that computing and computer programming are terribly difficult. It's not a myth among all people, but there is a belief out there that only special nerdy people with personality problems can do it. I
Alguma outra questão? Quando vocês pensam, eu vou fazer uma questão. Okay, Don, I have a question. It's more a comment than a question. I feel that you are very optimistic concerning education. Most part of your slide, your presentation, you put good words to be connected with education. But otherwise, I, in my opinion, have seen two challenges that are very strong. The first one is when you have written that normally schools are a little bit anachronic position in relation with the cyber knowledge. It means that we are several years behind, and you say pay attention, we have to avoid this. This is my first question, my first concern. Is it possible to be in PS, to be not so many years behind? Computational or cyber knowledge? It means, is it possible? And I say that because for one hand, education is built in the idea of traditional knowledge. It means that in a consensual knowledge is normally a kind of old knowledge. It means that normally you teach in a school things that are normally seen by people as right, is established. It means that you need some kind of future perspective to see now, okay, this is good to be in the school because there is no more discussion about it. And for other hand, all the questions connected with the digital worlds, they run in another direction. It means that if you have something that was well established, it means that they have to be revised, rebuilt. It means that it's a kind of two different forces, that one pushing you to the future, in another, education put you in the back, in the past. This is my first comment. And the second one is, it's about one of your phrases, I don't remember, where you say we have to localize, we have to find some special kind of things that robots are not able to do, because this is the challenge that you have to keep the jobs. I think it's a little bit like this. But this is for me, and my perception is that, okay, you have to search, to define the area where robots and other things that not take the jobs, and you have to propose a kind of education to prepare people to do this, because robots cannot do. We have to keep this for ourselves. But if you look the history of the entrance of the robots in the industry and the others, is it that there is any area that is protected from robots? You told about secretaries, but I don't know. Is there a place where you can, for sure, say that it's a human-like job positions? Because otherwise, you have to rethink what we call education for work. Because if you believe that robots could do anything that we do, the education is not for work, it's maybe for other things. That's not only for work. Sorry for my long explanation. It's two kind of concerns that I...
Well, thank you very much for the questions, actually. So I answered the second one first, because it's in my mind. So we could distinguish between non-robotic work and meta-robotic work. So as you rightly say, there is always a question, how much of life is non-robotic? And the question has been asked of artificial intelligence, of course. Can they take over? Can they do everything? Can they be intuitive, creative, even expert? All these things have been questioned. I mean, actually, when I talked about meta-robotic work, I mean something narrower. I really just mean that I think and I hope there are quite a lot of jobs that we need to do almost for the robots. We need to build them, design them, maintain them, clean them. We need to make them work together because the different ones from different companies may not work together. There's likely to be a lot of expertise involved in this. Say I am a hospital and I want little robots running around dispensing medicines and doing all sorts of helpful things. They may come from different companies. We may order the wrong ones. They may have different plugs and sockets, like hi-fi equipment. There's actually quite a lot of consultative work, just as there is in IT generally. I mean, the IT systems here all work, but it's not a coincidence. I mean, you need experts who can make them work together. So this is not the whole of non-robotics, and I suppose if we were science fiction writers, we might imagine that one day the robots will be able to repair each other, and this sort of thing, and maybe there's some truth in that. But I can imagine a chaotic world full of robots that have secret circuitry inside them and do wicked things for the people who built them and cause all sorts of trouble, and they can't talk to each other. And the companies that made them build in circuitry so they will not cooperate with other robots. And so you need experts who are in on all this. They know the word on the street that this one from one company just won't work in the hospital with another one. So I'm thinking of a partial solution, not a complete solution. But also there's the issue of national independence. When they come to my country, for example, I don't really want them all to come from America and all to be run by American consultants who we have to fly in and pay so that they can give us their American advice. I mean, there is an issue of losing. And of course, it's at its worst in the military. We don't want our rockets and our planes to be, more or less an instrument of the government of the country where they were manufactured. So that's a partial answer, and I think it probably goes much further than I've said. I mean, the skills will be quite sophisticated, and in the case of humanoid robots, I mean, we can all laugh at them when we see them in Japan looking like people, and so on and so forth. But my goodness, if they start to work in my hospital, and they start to be receptionists, and worst of all, surgeons. If we were to employ them, we really need people who can watch them and turn them off and all this sort of thing. But that's a rather long answer on meta-robotics. But that's why I introduced the term. I mean, I think non-computable would be one on the non-side, or non-robotic. But then you asked the first question about how optimistic we can be about school education in relation to these subjects. So let me try to give an optimistic answer, and it's also further response to this lady at the back who asked about the personal skills that we will want to be transmitting. So let me just give you an example. I'll just go down in my slides a bit. Oh, there we go. I can get more slides very quickly if you wish on this, but this is IBM Watson. It is a combination of 4 things, which is natural language interface, big data analytics, probabilistic reasoning, and parallel hardware. Its critics say it's not very original, and they say, but we made it work, and we've got it working in a lot of industries. So the question in response to you and the lady at the back is, could we give a reasonable idea about this to school kids? Because my goodness, if we don't, It's in so many industries that they are being disempowered. They're not being educated. Now, to assume they could just go and work for IBM, that might be too optimistic. But here's something which I would think very few adult citizens know. And it's quite easy to understand. And my claim will be that we could teach it to school kids. So this is called the candidate generation selection pipeline. Now that sounds very technical, but all that's really going on is that a question is given to Watson and it starts generating answers. And what it does, as you see there, is it generates more and more answers till it's got hundreds of thousands of answers. Remember, it's using massive parallelism, which it can employ from the cloud, which makes it scalable. So the more parallelism it needs, it just pays a few dollars and it gets more. It's very efficient. So you end up with a huge set of possibilities, and it then goes through a process of picking out the one it likes through something called scoring and ranking. Now, none of this is very hard to understand. And once we understand it, we know what the thing is doing. Now, there is some publicity that says, oh, Watson thinks like a brain. I mean, for goodness sake, how do we know whether it thinks like a brain? We don't even know exactly how the brain works. We'd like to, but we don't know yet. I don't think thinks like a brain is informative at all. But putting it out like this is actually very helpful. And we can see what it's doing and how it does it. And you could be 14 years old and learn this. Underlying this is the unstructured information management architecture. Again, I mean, in my country, this is called O-level education. It's for kids of 14, 15. It's not that difficult. But you come out really knowing more than you did when you went in. That's the architecture that underlies what was on the first slide, which was that one. And this is another representation of the same thing. Very good for school kids, I would think. It's nicely explained. And I think we have to, I'm not a friend of IBM, by the way. I'm not a secret employee or something. But I respect what I see they've done from an educational point of view. They've explained well what they're up to. And I mean, there may be people in the AI labs at MIT and Stanford who are not very impressed. In fact, there actually are people here on this campus who are not very impressed. And in a way, they're right. This is not cutting-edge research. This is practical implementation of knowledge we already have, working with the oil industry, marketing, health. Goodness, it goes on and on. But particularly where pattern detection is involved, the big data analytics component is just what you need. Now, I don't think I've said anything in the last 5 minutes which couldn't be said to 14-year-olds. That's the scoring and ranking. But, you know, they could be asked to draw this in their examinations. I don't think it's any harder than anything else. But they would, you know, it's just an example from me that this is big time stuff. This is not theory. It's practice. This is not a perspective. It's engineering work which is being used in, for example, sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy, because when you've got this thing going, and that the humans can talk to it in 8 different languages, it can talk back, and it can detect big patterns. So one example is railway safety in China. You know, that's a growing railway network. Sustainable agriculture, of course, it matters what patterns come up with droughts. Thank you. With droughts and so on, and what has happened in the past. And this is called cognitive computing, and it doesn't have to come from IBM. But it is a way of doing things. And I think we don't have to be teaching childish little games to children where their clever little computer controls a little robot that eats a banana or whatever it is. You know, I mean, we can be much more real world than that. So they start getting used to this sort of thing. And notice also, it's not science fiction. I mean, it's not trying to take over a spaceship like in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It doesn't have a personality, you know. It doesn't have feelings. It's like asking a spanner whether it has a personality. You know, I mean, that's not the game they're playing. But just to take you back there, I mean, that's perhaps rather a long answer, but it's perhaps quite a tractable one. Of course, I think computer programming is a useful thing to do, mainly because it teaches algorithmic thinking. And that helps us to understand computers. But this is more high-level stuff in the category of what I would call cyberology. Also, interestingly, it's not particularly speculative. I mean, this is not the sociology of whether computers will become so human that they're part of our society. I mean, we can ask these questions if we want, but I mean something much more practical, that this is going on all over the world, perhaps in undesirable ways. The police force of Dubai want to become a cognitive police force, running a cognitive city, and goodness knows what all that means. But at least as young citizens, we want people to be savvy. Do you know the word savvy? Savvy means you're not easily fooled, and people can't just talk around you with terminology. And if somebody says, oh, the candidate generation selection paradigm is something you wouldn't understand, little boy, is it? You know, if somebody does that, you say, well, actually, I do understand it. You can see the sort of results I'm hoping for here. And this is not alone. A problem with textbooks on artificial intelligence is they tend to be quite high level. For example, if it's natural language processing, they may be telling the reader about things they don't really need to know. They concern developments that were made 10 years ago which didn't quite work out, and so on and so forth. Well, an example, I'll give another example if I can just keep talking. Machine translation has improved enormously. Now, speech creation from text is quite easy, but speech recognition is less easy. And then we want the machine to translate from what it's got into another language so that we can build this stuff into our mobile phones or into the cloud-hosted software and hardware that supports them. So it doesn't have to be in your handset. But I would like to see, and this is a very simple point, I would like to see school kids coming out who find it just obvious that a solution at the moment is that we invent a restricted business English, restricted business Portuguese. So you're only allowed to use, say, 200 words. And it is just a fact of engineering that if we had little handbooks, Portuguese and English, and I'm only allowed to use 200 words, you're only 200 words, and we had these translating phones, which are perfectly technically possible. The handset can be the same, but at the infrastructure level, they have the translation system. It could all work. But this is not some brilliant insight of mine. This is just a fact about machine translation. So that's another example where I would like to see school kids coming out who find this fairly obvious. Because at the moment, how to say it without sounding pompous, but 18-year-olds tend to know what's on the market that they can afford, that's in the shops on the high street. But we'd like to see a bit more than that. We'd like to see them actually understanding things so they can argue with the shop assistants and say, well, I'm not really impressed, actually, because I don't think you've done, I don't think your supplier has done everything they could do. Or if I may give another example, still answering the two people, that's intelligent agents. So the interesting thing about intelligent agents is they've been highly developed. The word is that Microsoft has spent $1 billion on this research, but we haven't really heard about them yet. Well, what's going on is that Microsoft think they can make more money if they make us wait. They think that if they release them now, we will not be hungry enough. But if they somehow make us wait, we'll become hungry and give them all our money. So what an intelligent agent does, and this has been in the AI labs for decades actually, is it's like a butler. You know butler? Yeah. So the butler gets to know you personally and looks after you, and would normally be a software entity rather than a flashy-looking handheld device, because it doesn't need to be a handheld device, right? But anyway, it gets to know you, it gets to know your habits, it gets to know what you want. While you're asleep, it searches the internet for information on cricket, because you like cricket, and it compiles your own personal cricket newspaper, but it only gives it to you on a Sunday because it knows you're very busy. And it's on Sunday morning you want to read your personally compiled and printed cricket newspaper. Now, again, going back to the kids, this is just well-known stuff, but they don't know it. It's not secret. This is not military secrets. You can look up intelligent agent. You won't find very much because somehow it hasn't really hit the market, but it's not classified information. And so the sort of thing that happens in your relationship with your intelligent agent is that it gets to know so much about you that you don't have to say very much. So it's like getting to know a person well. Are you coming then? Somebody will say to me, well, what they mean is, I know you go to the cricket match every Tuesday afternoon and I want to go with you as we did last week, all this stuff. So we communicate very briefly because the other person knows what's going on. So with your agent, with your butler or PA, people sometimes say it's a digital PA, it knows that I go to Sweden's restaurant on Tuesdays at 6 o'clock, and I normally meet person A, person B, and person C. And it has their phone numbers, and it knows this. It also can find out when Sweden's is shut, when it's open, and it's really my job to tell the agent if I'm going to do something unusual, because it gets to know what's normal. So I say, hello, agent, and it says, hello, Donald. And I say, okay, 6 o'clock, one extra person. That's it. Bye-bye. And this is not difficult stuff. We do this with each other all the time. And I might say one extra person who's a vegetarian, and the agent has to do its best to work out if Sweden's can cope with a vegetarian. The answer is yes. And you can imagine further cases. I go to visit Dubai, for example, and I like Indian food. And the agent knows this. So I take it with me, so to speak. Actually, it stays in its house in the cloud. But it's kind of with me all the time. And so, because it can communicate. So I arrive in Dubai, and I say, hello, agent. And I say, oh, I'm hungry. And it just thinks, oh, it'll be Indian again. It's boring old Don. He always eats Indian. So it goes on the internet, and it finds that there are 3 near us. And it knows I like South Indian food by preference, if possible. And one of them is, but you have to travel a bit further. And so it finds out where to get a taxi because it knows I'm willing to pay for taxis. Yeah? Maybe not a helicopter, but a taxi. And this, this is all stuff a human butler will do for the Queen or Prince Charles. It happens all the time. And so I say, I'm hungry. And it says, well, Donald, we've got one North Indian within 10 minutes drive, and we've got a South Indian within 15 minutes drive. Which will it be? I say, book the South Indian one, but it's only me today. And so, it goes and books one. It has speech production. It can talk to the Indians. It can speak their language too. Not that there's only one Indian language, but it can speak other people's languages. And this is all possible. But my point for education is I would really like to see school kids coming out of school knowing this stuff, even though it's not really on the market. And I would like to see parents being aware of it too, because an almost inevitable development will be that when intelligence agents come on the market, it will provide a rather tricky advantage to rich kids because their parents can buy for them an educational agent, which is particularly programmed to help them write their essays and to help them to be a good student. And who can say this is completely wrong? I mean, if it's helping them to be a good student, it's not helping them to cheat, it's helping them to be a student. So that's going to be a bit tricky because they will be expensive and they'll be personal. Now, were you wanting to speak? Well, on you go then. But kids should know this stuff, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, so actually, I always get fascinated by those kind of new technologies and how they can change our lives. But this whole idea they represent in the first part was like opportunity, but I see a huge risk attached to this idea, and that's why I would like maybe a comment, because I was thinking about how this same Watson and AI technologies, how can they threat democracy? Because we have this huge confusion on Brexit, we have this Cambridge Analytica issued in US, and you had in last September 2050 a huge there was 10 days before our elections last year. We have this huge data leaking on Facebook in Brazil, and now we know that Steve Bannon was working for the campaign, for Brazilian campaign. So this represents a huge risk for democracy. So how do you see that?
Well, it's cases like that that have caused me to keep saying the word ditropic, because I think it really needs a name. And these are, I think, uncontestable examples you've given of the illicit use of these technologies. But they also make my point about articulation, because when I saw Facebook for the first time, of course I wasn't fooled. You look at its default privacy settings, and within a minute you know that the business model is data harvesting and selling on without permission. Right? Now, I could do it because I spent years in computer science. But I think if school education were better, everybody could do it. It's a good case for me, because I think it makes the point that the public is not stupid. It's not that. But we are years behind technogenic reality, which includes Facebook. And so it was possible for Facebook just to stroll along, harvesting people's data. I mean, you turn the thing on, it has various privacy settings. The default is always set to tell the whole world, right? You have to deliberately switch them off. Then they have an upgrade. What's going to happen? Deep in the interface, more defaults will be set to tell the whole world. You know, who are they trying to kid? They're trying to kid people who've been taught by an anachronistic education system. And I don't disagree with your example at all. Cambridge, and that's a bit more difficult because it's the politics of democracy and maybe not so obvious as Facebook was. But I think bringing it out in the open is the healthiest thing that's happened. And I mean, Zuckerberg should be in prison, but so should Tony Blair, in my view. But he isn't, and that's just life. Some people can protect themselves. But I'd be very surprised if he tried the same tricks in the future as easily. I mean, at least he'll be embarrassed. So I'm arguing in favor of articulation, conceptualization of, well, things like Watson, intelligent agents, so that their ditropic nature can be brought out. And on the negative side of ditropism, I didn't say anything against IBM Watson. I mean, it's almost impossible that there's no wicked way of using this. Pattern detection from surveillance data could show that you go and buy a hamburger every Friday, and you always meet a man with a pointy hat and a big lump under where his wallet is supposed to be, and they will say, you know, spies are everywhere, and they'll come and catch you. It's a good question, thanks.
Algum comentário mais? Então, acho que a gente pode agradecer o professor Dom. Muito obrigado.